Miami 2016 wasn't just another Grand Prix, it was a weekend where literally everything happened. The driver who had been dominating the season won again, but not as expected because this weekend nothing came easy for him. He made mistakes, suffered like never before, and still won, and at the end he dedicated the victory to someone who is no longer with us. On the other hand, the team that generated the most excitement over the weekend because of all the updates they brought came to the race convinced that they could win. And they had the car to do it, but they made a bad decision at the key moment that cost them the victory. Also, there was a driver who was about to finish on the podium, but he lost it all on the last lap. It wasn't a rival or a maneuver, but his own mistake that led to a penalty. And finally, a world champion who came to Miami with the best car he's had all year saw everything slip away from him on the first lap. However, he said something worth hearing because it could be a sign that everything is about to change. This is the full analysis of the 2026 Miami Grand Prix, a weekend that had history, drama, controversy, and moments that won't be easily forgotten because this could be the beginning of a completely different championship. 3 races, 3 poles, and 3 victories. There isn't a single driver in the history of Formula 1 who has turned their first 3 pole positions into victories. Not Senna, not Schumacher, not Verstappen. No one, and Kimi Antonelli, at just 19 years old, has just broken this record. But the most impressive thing isn't the statistic, it's how he did it. Because Miami wasn't an easy victory. In the sprint, he had a slow start and lost positions. Toto Wolff clarified afterward that it wasn't his fault, but rather an issue with energy management. But still, the weekend got off to a rough start. Then, in the main race, he locked up going into the first corner and was overtaken by Leclerc. Afterward, Norris overtook him, and he had to fight back from behind. He also admitted that the heat and humidity in Miami were the worst he has ever experienced in his career. However, when the car and the team needed a driver, Kimi showed up. Mercedes executed an undercut perfectly. And Antonelli came out right next to Norris, wheel to wheel at the pit lane exit. A young 19-year-old driver against the current world champion on the most important lap of the race. However, despite the pressure, Kimi didn't budge. He stood his ground and came out victorious. Then, he kept widening the gap lap after lap until the race was decided. But there's something more this weekend that goes beyond records and numbers. After crossing the finish line, Antonelli dedicated the victory to Alex Zanardi, a friend of his family who passed away last week. Zanardi was a Formula 1 driver in the 90s. Later, he suffered a devastating accident that cost him both legs. And he became a symbol of overcoming adversity that the whole world admired. For Antonelli, he was someone close. And that image of a 19-year-old driver thinking about someone who is no longer here. That's what, for me, not only shows that he's a great driver, but also the kind of person he is. Finally, at Mercedes' hospitality suite, Lionel Messi is waking him up. A soccer world champion shaking hands with who seems to be the next big star of Formula 1. And although Antonelli's weekend was brilliant, it wasn't all good news for Mercedes. On the other side of the garage, the situation is becoming really uncomfortable for George Russell. Let's go over the whole weekend from the Englishman's perspective. In the sprint qualifying, Antonelli was more than 2/10 faster than him. In the sprint race, Russell finished 4th. But only after Antonelli received a penalty that dropped him from 4th to 6th place. Without that penalty, Russell would have finished 5th behind Kimi. In qualifying for Sunday's race, the gap to his teammate was almost 4/10, and in the race, Russell finished 43 seconds behind Antonelli. The Briton tried to explain it afterwards. He said that Miami is a low-grip circuit that favors drivers who can slide the car, and that's not his style. That may be true, but there's more to it. The difference between the two is no longer just about driving. It's about confidence, adaptation, and that ability to get the most out of the car in conditions that aren't perfect. And Antonelli in the last 3 races has shown that. Also, to add some controversy to the situation, the question is starting to come up. To what extent is Mercedes still treating both drivers as equals? In recent seasons, the top teams reached a point where one of their drivers started to have strategic priority over the other. Not explicitly, but in practice. For now, it seems that this is not the case, but it's no secret how fond Toto Wolff is of Kimi. So, taking all this into account, we'll see how things develop in the coming months, especially considering that there's a team that seems to be catching up to Mercedes if they haven't already. That's why now it's time to talk about McLaren, but before that, as you can see in this image, 90% of the people who watch my videos are not subscribed to the channel. So let's fix that. Subscribe to reach 100,000 subscribers, we're almost there. McLaren's weekend was a roller coaster. On Friday, in the sprint qualifying, Lando Norris got the first pole of the year for McLaren. And not only that, but on Saturday he won, while Piastri finished second.
Un 1-2 perfecto para McLaren.
That's how the first non-Mercedes win of the year came about, and it was a sign that the MSL 40 with its upgrade package could compete on equal terms with Toto Wolff's team. And then came Sunday's qualifying, where everything fell apart. A problem with the car's software made Norris slower on some straights. This was reflected in the fact that McLaren was the only team that didn't improve its times compared to the previous day's sprint. From fighting for pole, Norris dropped to 4th place, while Piastri qualified 7th. However, in the race, both of them recovered positions. And finally, Norris finished 2nd and Piastri 3rd. A podium that, considering the results of the previous races, is a great achievement. But despite that, Norris said the following.
Estoy destrozado por haberme quedado sin la victoria en Miami. Creo que hoy era posible. Tenemos que ser honestos y decir que debimos haber parado antes. No debimos haber estado esperando. Tenemos que revisar las cosas. Pudimos haber peleado más por la victoria.
And if there was any chance to beat Mercedes in Miami, that was the moment. But McLaren let it slip away. For me, the weekend has two interpretations. The first one is worrying. A software error in qualifying. It cost them the chance to fight for pole position, while a strategic error cost them a possible victory. But the second interpretation is encouraging. When the car works and the strategy is right, they're the only ones who, for now, can challenge Mercedes. Especially considering that they will introduce another major upgrade package in Canada, which they hope will put them ahead of the German team. And although everything looks very good for McLaren, there's another team that made a big step forward this weekend and hopes to contend for wins, but I'll talk about that later. For now, let's go to one of Sunday's key moments. The race started with total chaos, which nobody expected. Antonelli and Verstappen braked late into the first corner, locked up, and were overtaken by Leclerc. Then there was contact between Lewis Hamilton and Franco Colapinto at turn 11 on that same lap. Hamilton lost part of his front wing and raced like that for the entire race. Afterwards, he acknowledged the incident and apologized to Ferrari over the radio. And while all that was happening, Max Verstappen, who had qualified second after being overtaken by Leclerc, spun 360 degrees and lost many positions. A spin that, on a weekend when Red Bull arrived with the most important upgrades of the year, destroyed any chance of fighting for victory. But to understand why that spin was so frustrating, we need to talk about what Red Bull brought to Miami. Verstappen struggled badly through the first 3 races of the year. The car had serious aerodynamic problems, and it started the season overweight. And without a single podium, this was his worst start to a season since his debut in 2015. But during the break between Japan and Miami, Red Bull worked hard, and the results were clear. Verstappen qualified second, Red Bull's best qualifying result in 2026. Even he said it himself, and I quote, "I feel like I have more control again. The upgrades are working. From here on, it's like seeing a light at the end of the tunnel." A driver who had been frustrated for months finally smiled again. But as I mentioned, on a weekend where the car had real potential to fight at the front, the spin he had on the first lap ruined everything. And although he finished 5th and scored points, the car ended up far from where it deserved to be. And because of this, the question arises, can Red Bull, with the upgrades they've introduced, fight for victories? Because if Verstappen in the 4th race is already qualifying second, the answer is starting to become clear. However, McLaren and Red Bull weren't the only top teams that brought upgrades to Miami. So yes, it's time to talk about Ferrari. Ferrari arrived in Miami with real expectations. They came with the most comprehensive upgrade package of the year up to that point, revised floor for more downforce, weight reduction in several areas of the chassis, improvements in thermal management, and a software update to optimize energy. In addition, the FIA had modified the regulations regarding super clipping so that it would last less time for everyone, a rule that, in theory, aimed to cut Mercedes' advantage. And the first signs that weekend were promising. Leclerc was the fastest in Friday's practice. However, at the first key moment of the weekend, during the sprint qualifying, Leclerc could only qualify 4th. Then in the sprint race, he finished 3rd and managed to get a podium, and in qualifying for Sunday's race, he qualified 3rd. A promising position considering Ferrari's advantage at the start. For his part, Hamilton qualified 6th. So it was clear that Ferrari had a car capable of fighting at the front, but from the promises on Friday to the result on Sunday, there was a huge gap. Hamilton picked up front wing damage on the first lap and had to race like that for the rest of the race. In the end, he finished 6th. Not because the car lacked pace, but because of that initial mistake that ended up costing him so much. And then Charles Leclerc arrived. The Monegasque was having a great race. He fought with Antonelli during the first stint and was in the lead for a few laps. After a classic Ferrari strategy disaster, he managed to stay in podium positions. On the last lap, after being overtaken by Piastri and dropping to 4th position, he lost control of the car and hit the wall. The steering arm was damaged, but despite that, he continued. He cut several chicanes to reach the finish line. He pushed the lapped car of Arvid Lindblad to make his way through. He made contact with Russell and crossed the line after being overtaken by the Brit and by Verstappen. In a single lap, he dropped from 3rd position to 6th. But unfortunately for him, that didn't work. That was all. After the race, the stewards reviewed everything that happened and concluded that the damage to Leclerc's car was not enough reason to leave the track and gain an advantage. Because of that, he received a 20-second penalty in the race, and from 6th, he dropped to 8th, a total disaster. Ferrari brought their best updates of the year to Miami, with a rule change that favored them and the fastest car in practice and qualifying. However, they left with Hamilton in 6th place and Leclerc in 8th, and that's the story of Ferrari. And although I already talked about the top teams, there are some drivers worth mentioning. In the midst of all the drama up front, several things also happened in the pack. On one hand, Franco Colapinto had a very solid weekend. He arrived at the sprint having qualified 8th, beating his teammate Pierre Gasly. That way, both Alpines made it into SQ3. Then, in the sprint race, he finished 10th, and although it was a good result, it wasn't enough to score points. Then, in qualifying for Sunday's race, he qualified 8th again, and in the main race, he drove magnificently and finished in 7th place. His best result in Formula 1 thanks also to Leclerc's penalty. That way, he scored 6 points in the championship. Race by race, the Argentine is looking more comfortable in the car. And now, having scored more points, he will also be able to have greater confidence. On the other hand, behind him, in 9th and 10th place, came the two Williams, Carlos Sainz and Alex Albon, a result worth mentioning because the team was coming off a very weak season. So it seems that the English team, little by little, is trying to turn things around. And in a season where the Constructors' Championship is what distributes the money, those points they scored matter. 4 races, and Kimi Antonelli has been on the podium in all 4. The last 3 have been victories. These results give him a 20-point lead over Russell, and it leaves the championship picture with a pretty clear direction. Norris scores, Piastri scores, Verstappen scores, but even so, they're still far from the leader. And the reality is that so far when the Mercedes has performed well, no one has been able to challenge Antonelli. So the question that remains is that going to change? McLaren showed this weekend that they have the pace to fight. Red Bull with the upgrades seems to be waking up. And Verstappen with a fast car can be very dangerous. Meanwhile, Ferrari is still trying to turn speed and development into results. And Antonelli, with every race that passes, gains something very valuable. Experience leading a championship. The next race is in Canada, a low downforce circuit, with a wall close by where Formula 1 has historically delivered surprises, and where McLaren will bring its new upgrade package. That weekend might be where someone makes life difficult for Mercedes, maybe McLaren, maybe Red Bull, or it could be the weekend where Antonelli gets his 4th victory and manages to extend his lead. Formula 1 is back in full force. And if you don't want to miss anything and want all the information, subscribe. See you next time.